but we know that there are other major activities going on in various fields, especially or parallel fields, parallel efforts, including in the federal agency. So I was very happy to see this presentation put on the agenda. Rebecca and I have a little bit of a history back dating when she was working at NPS, or the National Park Service, sorry. And so, Rebecca, I'm going to let you introduce your colleagues and then you can just take it away.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks to everyone for this opportunity to talk with you today. The introductions are particularly helpful for us to see the broad spectrum of expertise that you have online today. I will be joined here by my colleagues Leanne Spaulding and Hamid Ghasemi, so hopefully you'll be able to see them here very soon. What we're going to be talking about today from DOT spans many topics. We're going to be starting from the policy and tools, talking about some of the funding from DOT, talking about extreme heat, and going into topics more about resilience and the particular elements for infrastructure. But before we go there, let me ask Leanne to come off mute and just say a quick hi to y'all, so you'll see who's coming up. I'll kick off and then we'll go to Leanne. And we can go to the next slide while Leanne's coming off mute.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to join you today. My name is Leanne Spaulding. I work at the Office of the Secretary, particularly on the environmental policy team with Rebecca Beavers. My background is in resilience and adaptation policy. I joined DOT about a year ago, most recently from the city of New York, where I worked at the mayor's office for a year on adaptation and resilience. So have a great urban focus. I worked on resilience with a very broad lens, not just particularly on transportation, but it's been great to join the federal team and have this transportation focus and be able to collaborate with you all in different spheres and learn more about resilience and adaptation at the federal government. Thanks.
Thanks, Leanne. Hamid?
Yeah, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure meeting everyone virtually. I joined Office of Secretary of Transportation Research Development and Technology Office about a year ago to lead the transportation resilience component of the climate change. Prior to that, I was with Federal Highway Administration Terminal Fairbank Highway Research Center. I led numerous research studies. One was long-term bridge performance program, which is similar to resiliency. A lot of tools and technologies on infrastructure asset management and novel tools and technology, sensing technology, and on post-hazard evaluation. Actually, I was very fortunate to have the opportunities to inspect and evaluate transportation infrastructure conditions and performance, and observe and analyze how resilient the transportation systems are after the earthquake in Turkey, Japan, China, and Chile numerous times. And it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you,
Hamid.
Hey,
and
Rebecca.
Go ahead, Dan.
I just want to interrupt you real quick. Mari Tai joined us, and Mari's been deeply involved in these activities for quite some time. So I'd just like for her to introduce herself. Just name and affiliation, Mari, if possible.
Hi, yes, apologies for being late again. Mari Tai, I'm a project scientist at the National Centre for Atmospheric Research, and also member of the Committee on Adaptation to a Changing Climate at the ASCE, so involved on both the science and the engineering side of things.
Thank you, Mari. Okay, Rebecca, it's back to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Dan. And Mari, are you down the road at NCAR? Are you up in Boulder?
I am indeed.
Okay, I'm based in Lakewood, Colorado, so I just thought I would say hi. A couple of Colorado connections here, and as well as others who are dealing with the Upper Colorado Basin topics. I did want to point out we had Gretchen Goldman join in on the phone. Gretchen, I'll just do your intro since I know it can be hard to come off mute if you're doing that. Gretchen is one of the co-directors for our Climate Change Center that we host within Department of Transportation. And the Climate Change Center is a major focus for all of our modes of transportation. I'll highlight some of those in a couple coming slides, but the ability to transmit information related to science, policy, other relations for tools. And oftentimes we also host guest speakers. So if you're finding after this conversation, I'll put it out there, you'd like to come and engage more fully with our Climate Change Center, there may be more opportunities in the coming weeks. So with that, we're going to kick off the talk here today, and we can go to the next slide. So I'll be focusing on climate and natural hazards, tools, policy, funding, etc. And why am I here talking to you? So a little bit more of my background, other than just the organizer here. I joined the Office of the Secretary about a year and a half ago. I came over from the National Park Service, where I'd worked for a couple decades on adaptation topics. My background's in geology. I have a PhD focused on coastal science, but it evolved very quickly to looking at all types of natural hazards. And so one of these examples here comes from Alaska, and our relations that we have with so many Native Alaskan communities that are losing their livelihoods and cultural heritage as some of these waters rise. I had a superintendent from the Western Arctic parks come to me and say, Rebecca, this is great. You know a lot about the Southeast. You know a lot about the Atlantic. You know a lot about the Gulf. You're missing it in Alaska. So it's very humbling when you have people come in and say, you need to come up here and see what's happening with diminished sea ice and the other impacts. So one thing I can say in my time with the National Park Service, I was able to visit the coastline of all U.S. states, as well as work on a variety of topics, inland, upland, as well as in some of our most hazardous areas, because some of those areas also make some of the most scenic ones for parks. You know, everything from volcanoes to arches to Grand Canyons, etc. So I have had the privilege of working in many of those areas. But to tie back in here to the link to transportation and why I made that shift, when we're looking at topics such as shorelines eroding more rapidly from winter storms, when there's less sea ice to protect these areas, when permafrost is thawing, we have buildings that are settling, etc. And I was able to be up in Alaska last year on a permafrost and infrastructure symposium, working with some of our UTC university centers for transportation. And really see, if you haven't been to Northern Alaska, at times I felt like I was on the Louisiana bayous at times with the amount of flooding and the waters standing underneath buildings. So we do have a lot of challenges coming to both the structures and the way that we access those locations. Next slide. So coming back to Department of Transportation, the strategic plan here has a handful of key goals. If you'll notice, they're also on my slide too, if you need reminders we go through. But topics such as safety, equity, and going into our professional excellence and other topics, those will actually be a continued focus. But today here, we're going to focus a lot more on the climate and sustainability elements. And if you need some graphics to key you in on all the different modes of transportation we'll be talking about, it's everything from the Federal Aviation Administration for air travel, federal highways. I'm sure you're well versed in some of those topics, but also motor carrier, maritime administration, transit. Leanne, who's on, has, we have extensive experience working with some of our more metropolitan areas, all the way to National Highway traffic safety, and even Great Lakes and Federal Rail. So I'll also highlight some information related to pipelines. So just wanted to give you that broad suite of these different 9 areas for transportation focus. Next slide. We have a climate adaptation plan that we worked a lot with CEQ and Office of Management and Budget on. The new plan will focus from 2024, current year, to 2027. It includes the same priorities that we had in our DOT Climate Action Plan from 2021. Once again, incorporating resilience into DOT grant and loan programs. I will be speaking to that a bit more. Enhance resilience throughout the project planning and development process. We'll also cover some of that, and ensure resiliency of DOT's facilities and operational assets. You'll hear more from Hamid on that. Additional work on climate-ready services and supplies, and improved climate education and research. I'll give you a couple ideas of that, but no, there's a lot more work throughout DOT that we can only give you a sample of here today. Next slide. A couple things that I thought were very key for you to be aware of within Department of Transportation. One is the DOT Climate Policy Order. This is for climate adaptation resilience policy for the operational assets for which DOT maintains. So interestingly enough, a lot of the highways, rail systems, et cetera, are not directly managed by the Office of the Secretary of the Department of Transportation. We engage a tremendous amount with metropolitan planning organizations, State Department of Transportations, et cetera. But some of these assets would be all the communication towers that we have for FAA, so that we can provide that secure transmissions as well as communication for a lot of our air travel, as well as the Maritime Academy. So those merchant mariners receive their training in the Northeast in a facility managed by Department of Transportation. So there are key operational assets in terms of the offices that DOT staff work within. So some of the structural assessments we're talking about relate to those facilities as well. But surprisingly, the number of transportation assets we'll be talking about, not all of those are necessarily owned and maintained by Department of Transportation, though the regulations and the guidance that we're providing do relate to those assets themselves. And if you are not aware of M2403, that came out late last year in 2023 on advancing climate resilience through climate smart infrastructure investments. It also relates to implementation guidance for the Disaster Resiliency Planning Act. So I just raised that as one document to make sure that everyone is aware of. Next slide. So we have a lot of information from DOT programs and projects. Some of the information on building resilient infrastructure relates to some of our international work. That would be lower left cover. There's also a tremendous amount on nature-based solutions, how we are working with vulnerability assessments, bringing in that information to projects. So there is a lot to be covered. So the links coming in the chat. We can put some of those. We also have a lot of hyperlinks in the presentation. We have the PDF that we're prepared to share, and we can also make sure that the links come through. So I don't know if we'll hit them all as we're going through the presentation right now. So we'll make sure you do have access to that information. And I'll point you to a couple websites as we're going through, like DOT Navigator, that you'll be able to find some of that information. I'll also mention one thing that I've been working on is a DOT climate resilience review and gap assessment. So I've been working across the department, ability to just dive back in. Any of us who are PhDs love these research projects, to dive in onto the policies and guidance, climate informed design, education, operations of workforce, other types of topics, what we're even doing with compliance for NEPA. So I've basically been invited into DOT and has spent a lot of time studying the variety of information that's available, but also identifying where some of the gaps might be as we move forward. Next slide. While we focused on climate adaptation resilience here, I want to make sure that there is an incredible amount of information, effort, and expertise going towards design policies related to reducing greenhouse gases and prioritizing needs of low-income and minority communities. The U.S. National Blueprint for Transportation Decarbonization also follows with plans for each modal administration. So there are separate plans for both maritime as well as highways, air travel, et cetera. So all the goals of these are that this travel is convenient, efficient, as well as clean. Next slide. And a couple of these ideas that come through in terms of community design and land use planning. It's very important that we ensure how people can get to their jobs, how they can procure resources, go to school, maintain access to needed services such as medical or childcare. It's really important to recognize there are many planning and grant programs related to this information, but I also want to raise all the other assets associated with a lot of our transportation networks. This is, we're talking about sidewalks, bike lanes, safe streets. You may have seen some of the local streets in your communities being transformed. But it is really important to think about what it means as we encourage more active transportation, because that is one of the key things we say. Sometimes if we can get people out of cars and into other modes of transportation, we are going to be making more of a difference at these times. But also reconnecting communities that may have been impacted by prior transportation infrastructure and beginning to remove things such as minimum parking space requirements and looking at travel demand, efficiency, parking prices, et cetera. So just put those as a couple of things we're not focusing on as much today, but those clearly do have relations to all the work we do at transportation. Next slide. All right, I'm going to focus a little bit more on discretionary grants and formula funding because there is a tremendous amount of funding that moves through Department of Transportation. Next slide. Now, with these discretionary grants, some of the things we've done is provide checklist for strong climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience grant applications. And I will also highlight information here on the PROTECT program. Next slide. That program is promoting resilient operations for transformative, efficient, and cost-saving transportation. PROTECT. If you hear this this program, that's what it means. And even sometimes I need a reminder on keeping this information going forward. Next slide. PROTECT has both a formula program as well as discretionary grants. But one of the key things that happened when PROTECT was put in place by the bipartisan infrastructure law, it's to plan for and strengthen surface transportation. So some of those modes of transportation we mentioned, rail, transit, highways, but they need to be resilient to natural hazards, including climate change, sea level rise, flooding, extreme weather events, and other natural disasters through a variety of activities. And so next slide. Some of those activities include, this is funding for doing the planning. Oftentimes you recognize it's hard to put these programs in place if you don't have funding for the planning. So this does provide funding for resilience planning in terms of resilience improvement plans, pre-design, design activities, et cetera, and even evacuation planning and preparation. So the other element for resilience is resilience improvements. PROTECT is not necessarily the entire project, soup to nuts coming in. It really is the ability to add improvements to existing projects, as well as focus on community resilience, evacuation routes, and at-risk coastal infrastructure. I think much of your work has probably identified that infrastructure will be at risk. Well, once you've identified that, where's the funding to decide what to do next? And some of this type of funding provides money for that. Next slide. Examples of some of the awardees and the locations are here, but it's important to state that we really have gone through only 2 years of the funding for right now, and we're close to $830 million for 80 different recipients. And the notice for the next program should be coming out very soon. Next. Just some examples. These will be in the presentation provided to you, so I won't go through all of these. Some of it relates to, in Davis, California, ability to install cool pavement technologies. In West Memphis, on the right-hand side, more information to look at floodplain impacts and looking at nature-based solutions for restoring wetlands and forest. Next slide. For the Ogallala Sioux tribe in South Dakota, this is on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, looking at many of their roads and the need to widen ditches, increasing the size and number of culverts, and raising or widening sections of the road to add shoulders for emergencies. I've spent quite a bit of time out on Pine Ridge, and I can tell you it would be very, very beneficial to have many of these safety measures implemented. Now, also in North Carolina, we're looking at areas where we're using also some of the nature-based solutions to come in and protect sections of road. And the infamous Highway 12, I'm guessing some of you have probably visited that, and I did my research in North Carolina, so very familiar with the challenges for Highway 12 on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Next slide. Also, even here in Wisconsin, looking at vulnerability of bridges, culverts, dams, and roadways. So looking for repair and removal. And at least in Atlanta, this regional commission will look at information for a resilience improvement plan for Metro Atlanta. So this is that planning element. Next slide. More information on resources. As I said, these are the types of links you'll get with the presentation, and we may discuss it. May be more important for you to have the actual PowerPoint presentation where you can access the links. But for formula and discretionary grants, this is where you can get more information. And the formulas are the monies that go directly to the state Department of Transportations for implementation by a formula. Next slide. And one of the key things here is refining the guidance and criteria we use for our grants. So DOT has funding to distribute. We issue a notice of funding opportunity, and within that, we need to include criteria, and it is now standard across our funding opportunities for discretionary funding that we include the need for project proponents to address climate change and sustainability, and also the ability to rate these criteria when the projects are submitted. And the next slide. The key thing also is of projects that are implemented. How are we going to measure? What are the metrics that are being used to monitor, inventory, evaluate these types of projects? This is a key area that I think many agencies and departments across the federal sector, we are having multiple discussions with this with the U.S. Global Change Research Programs, Federal Adaptation and Resilience Group, and other areas. This is a big key element and partners we've talked with at EPA, with NOAA, and others. How do you actually measure the performance of some of these projects, particularly measuring nature-based solutions? So I saw some of that mentioned in some of your materials, but how do we look at these types of projects and say they have actually implemented resilient design features and they are performing as expected? So within the PROTECT program, there is actually a requirement to work on these metrics. And we also have a learning agenda item within DOT to look across all sectors of transportation and really drill in more on this particular topic. Next slide. I've only got a handful here before we transition to Leanne and the next topics, but I'm going to bring up this particular one. I showed some of the resources earlier, and this is the location where you can access those under federal highways, their sustainability and resilience resources. But pointing out some of these circulars, such as the HEC circulars, that give particular engineering guidance that I think are particularly relevant to some of your work. I've also been working with federal highways on, say, a sea level rise brief. Once again, you have a particular topic and then you need to give additional guidance to project staff that are implementing this, the engineers and other designers. Next. So other examples, I've focused on PROTECT, but another one is, what are the designs of the culverts? These are for aquatic organism passage. Next slide. Oh, thank you, Megan, for getting that in. We should have had our list of links to put into. But examples of culvert discretionary grants. Springbrook Creek Fish Passage in Bainbridge, Washington. Also other fish passage in California, Department of Transportation for coho salmon, steelhead trout. These are not specific to climate change, but I do say we need to look at our entire environment systems, and culverts are clearly one area that with the intersection of transportation that need some additional work and even clearer design criteria. Next slide. I also mentioned Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration's. This is their natural gas distribution infrastructure safety and modernization grant. This program is a new one, and it is the first discretionary grant program to address resilience, and that allows pipeline operators. Many of these are even private companies, but they need the funding to be able to repair, rehab, or replace aging pipeline infrastructure. And with this, our office of PHMSA, as we call it, Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, had to stand up a new office just to carry out this type of program. So there's a lot of work going on within DOT to address this available funding. All right, next slide. And finally, a few of these slides are just the additional resources and technical assistance. Next. And if you want to access information, this is the type of information we are trying to provide to the grant proponents. And next slide. Highlighting some of the resources, such as the checklist, even related to workforce and labor, but also climate change. And I think my final slide is next. And so these are some of the criteria. I'll raise this for a chance for discussion on these lessons and refinements as we all go along. We learn a lot, right? But how are the project sponsors addressing climate? We find we have communities all the way from small rural areas, tribal locations, to major metropolitan organizations. And what additional resources and technical assistance do they need? How can we refine the criteria in future rounds of funding? And how can we better track project outcomes? So these are some of the areas that we find are really important to implement, particularly some of these discretionary grant programs. And that is one thing I've learned at Department of Transportation. That particular Office of the Secretary does a lot of work with the discretionary grant programs, refining criteria in order to be able to more equitably and efficiently distribute this type of funding. So I think we'll go to Leanne, and then we might pause to see if there are some questions after Leanne gives us just another case study on extreme heat.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. I'm happy to have the opportunity just to quickly spotlight this unique climate hazard. Extreme heat has been given a real huge sense of urgency with this administration. We've all experienced and seen the news around the extreme heat events that have swept the country, including the heat domes. There's been a lot of coordination within the federal family to understand what we are doing federally, and that has sparked a lot of conversations within the Department of Transportation regarding our efforts on extreme heat and how we're speaking to this particular risk and what guidance we're providing. It's a unique risk in that it kills more Americans than any other climate risk combined. There is a public health and environmental health impacts component to it, which we may not see as much with the other climate risks, in addition to the infrastructural damages that are done by extreme heat events. Also, in terms of it receiving emergency response or emergency funding, it's not explicitly called out in the Stafford Act, which is what the legislative framework which guides FEMA in its response. And it's also often not really touched upon in state hazard mitigation plans. And so for these reasons, there are a number of gaps in how we really understand extreme heat and its impacts to the transportation system to some degree. So I would say this is an area where we think that we still have a lot to learn. I want to give you just a sense of some of the questions and discussions that we're having that will be shaping how we approach a next set of either guidance documents or updates to existing guidance documents that we currently have regarding climate risk. And so next slide. Extreme heat impacts to public transit is a particular area that we are discussing in depth at the moment with both FTA and across the Department of Transportation. We realize that there are some gaps that need to be addressed in terms of shade and bus shelters throughout public bus transportation systems. We've been asked to provide some new design guidance regarding bus shelters, but also to address the absence of mechanical cooling and other types of amenities in transit hubs and stations throughout public transportation systems in the country. The other thing we've been asked to provide some guidance on is materials usage in these projects. And so as you can see from the photo on the right, we've been asked to think about not just the temperature of these particular materials during a heat event and whether or not it's impacting the infrastructure itself, but what the experience of the public transportation riders would or could be as they're using the transportation system itself during these events. And while we don't have any answers currently, these are some of the areas in which we are looking to do some additional research or collaboration to provide some guidance. Next slide. Material selection. We do have some guidance around pavements and coatings and how cool pavements and coatings can protect infrastructure during extreme heat events. Some of the additional questions we're getting, though, are really in that environmental and public health space and to the end of, do they actually help reduce urban heat island impacts? There is also a proliferation of products specifically coatings that we're hearing that are emerging in the marketplace. And we have been asked if these products are all created equally and doing as they say they will do. So we are looking into whether there should be some further research to distinguish the quality amongst different products that are coming out specifically to address extreme heat and whether or not a third-party verification program would be appropriate. Next slide. Active transportation is certainly a component of transportation's approach to decarbonization. It is highly sensitive to temperature, however, and does impact the mobility, particularly among low-income communities of color that we've been targeting for active transportation projects to increase their mobility. So some of the things that we've been trying to understand is how do you quantify resilience of bike sharing demand under extreme heat scenarios? what factors contribute to bike sharing resilience, and how might some of this knowledge, as we gather it through partnerships and collaborations with the municipalities and others that are the holder of these data, might help us rethink and provide some guidance on how best to design active transportation projects given extreme heat events and other types of impacts. Next slide. We're also thinking about it in terms of operations and performance, both of the vessels themselves. I think there's been a lot in the news about impacts to the aviation industry, both from having to reconsider the lengths of runways to the design of the vessels themselves to be able to lift off and grapple with slower ascension times or additional turbulence or occupant thermal safety during delays. We've also recognized that there are issues with machines and electronics during extreme heat events. We've gotten some feedback about pressure and hydraulic systems, and if equipment isn't run every hour, that equipment has been impacted greatly, or tires melting. And so these are other considerations that we're going to need to take into account, both from the manufacturing side, but also as it impacts like the greater performance of certain sectors of the transportation field. Next slide. And then the last is occupational health and safety. Transportation represents 11% of the American workforce, and so that's roughly 16 million people. So we know that we have a sizable workforce, and a good percentage of them are outdoor workers, and that will be needing to provide some guidance and direction to different sectors of transportation, but also to our own federal employees about how best to protect themselves during these extreme heat events. And we have had a number of sectors come to us already looking for that type of guidance in collaboration with OSHA. So this is another area where we're currently exploring how best to collaborate and put forth some guidance. And with that, I'll pause and see if there are any questions or if we wanted to transition the conversation to Hamid. Thank you.
Rebecca, I defer to you.
Okay, I'm just waiting. I know we had some requests for links and other information. I did go ahead and send for it. While we shared a PDF, we have shared the full PowerPoint with you, and it's more to, we asked not to duplicate the slides from everyone. It's just more if you need to access the links on that information. So that should be available to you.
All right, thanks, Rebecca.
Your inboxes for Megan and Dan. But in terms of anyone else having questions on the material we presented?
And Dan, I have a quick question. Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Obey.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Very good presentation and nice information. My question is, I think it's great to see you're looking at planning for future conditions, right? And you mentioned HEC 25, HEC 17.
Yes.
And I've looked at those and I'm wondering if they are somewhat outdated already. I'm not sure. I've read this report, and I will mention the number, NCHRP Project 1561, which seem to have nice guidance. My question is, it's great for the federal level to provide this guidance, and I wonder how much of it is being implemented by the state DOTs, because sometimes they are reluctant to move into this arena in some states.
Yes, we have that. Hamid, do you want to take that question?
Can you repeat the question again? I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Yeah, I'll make it short. You have nice federal guidance at 2517 and others. The question is, to what extent the state DOTs actually absorbs them and implement them on the ground for their own projects? Because I think it's one thing for you to plan the federal highway project, but if the state highways are not keeping up in terms of planning or design or climate informed design, it's not going to work, I think, in the long run. I was curious to what extent state accept this guidance in their own planning.
You're absolutely correct. If you don't mind, I'm going to go through that during my presentation. Actually,
Okay,
I've covered
all
that
right, I will
area.
wait.
So if you
That
don't
sounds
mind.
good. All right,
That
thank
sounds
you,
good,
Ben.
thank you.
Do we have like specific questions for Rebecca or Leanne? Ben, I see you've got your hand up. Go ahead. I just don't want to, we got to be careful because Hamid has to leave. And I know how this group is. We get down into the discussion and it might take a while to get us back up. Ben?
Well, Dan, why let Hamid present and then open it up again. I can ask
Okay.
my question then.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate it.
All right.
Well,
Hand off to you, Hamid.
okay. Good afternoon again. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm new with OSTR, but I've been around for 25, 30 years, being at the state highway agencies, being in design office. I was at Caltrans for a while, doing a lot of design on the Bay Bridge. So I have a good understanding of the question that came up. Actually, I have a good understanding of how difficult and challenging it is to implement something new at state highway agencies. But today I'm wearing my research hat and my design hat, and giving you a snapshot of what our program at Climate Change Research and Technology Program as OSTR has done on resiliency over past years, mainly has been trying to figure out where the gaps in knowledge are and how best we can do to address these questions. Now, as Rebecca and Leanne mentioned, there are numerous research programs and efforts with all DOT modes and on the topic of resiliency. And I have to say that I have to be careful, but I have to say that a lot of them being done in silos. But one thing that it is, we are really having a hard time to incorporating climate resilience methodology into our transportation planning, design, and implementation, regardless of if it's a surface transportation, regardless of it's maritime, transit, and so forth. And there are good reasons for that. So I'm going to start with some background, brief background on resilience. Next, please. Sorry. And then I will discuss the impact of climate on our transportation systems. I have a lot of graphs from NOAA, and I really appreciate that. They're outstanding plots and really actually provide a lot of good information on what the issues are. Then briefly talk about the US DOT strategic plan, which I think is a critical plan to have and to know about it. And next are office activities on resilience, and finally discuss the short-term challenges. Next, please. So the issue is, so what is resilience to us? First of all, we have many types of resilience. One is operational, and one is structural, and so forth. And a lot of times mix those together. So it depends where you live and where we work and how we travel. That's how we define resilience. But at the end of the day, however we design it, do we have a plan for it? Next, please. So as you know, there are various definitions by several organizations, USDOT, FEMA, USGS, and NIST. And the US DOT is the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions and withstand, respond to, and recover from disruptions. FEMA includes capacity of people and organization and to adapt and rapidly recover. That's their concentration. USGS definition is very similar to US DOT. And NIST mainly concentrating on community resilience as a whole, as a system approach. Next, please. But we should keep in mind that by default, our colleagues in the earthquake engineering community who have had the longest history in accounting for resilience in design and implementation consider resilience an attribute of organization and people. And in their approach, functional recovery is the shortest amount of time, and that's by itself define what the resiliency planning is. I've been in many events after the earthquake. The number one priority in California and other countries was how soon you have the roads open for traveling public. Next, please. So if you talk about now climate change and warming world, it's not surprising that our transportation systems or communities are experiencing the impact of climate change. As we know, it will only get worse. Last year, almost daily, we saw headlines showing climate and weather disaster and damage to life, security of our infrastructures. And we experienced wildfires burning from coast to coast in Canada. Vermont experienced unprecedented flooding. This is unusual. Phoenix temperature, as you know, was topped 110 degrees Fahrenheit for about a month. And lastly, Hurricane Idalia, which we know about the amount of damage it has done. So this is an urgent issue, the issue of climate change, and it's the right time to talk about it, have conversation about it. Next, please. NOAA provided a lot of information on the state of damage and a lot of cumulative cost for the transportation vulnerability. So in 2017, the figure shows the cost of 16 separate weather events was about $306 million. Harvey was about 125 million, second to Katrina, which happened in 2005, for $161 billion. Next, please. Again, the continuation again in 2018 and 19, 136 billion. And 2019, 10 billion as far as the Midwest flooding. Next, please. So if you look at the 2023, we experienced about 28 separate weather or climate disasters with a cost of about $95 billion. And that kind of disaster has impact on all of our surface transportation, all of its infrastructure and maritime transit, and in a different ways, but they're all being impacted. And we don't have a solution for them. What do you do about them? How would you address those issues? Next, please. Let me put something into perspective. To provide a point of reference, this is a summary of U.S. transportation infrastructure inventory. The fact is that the 600, for example, over 600,000 bridges in the inventory. 1/3 of those bridges are structurally deficient. A lot of lifeline structures need an upkeep and upgrade. So the challenge is that, though, what is the current status of your structures if you plan to beef it up to protect it from climate change? So U.S. in general, U.S. has the largest multimodal transportation infrastructure system in the world, carrying about $10 trillion good, roughly about 60% of GDP. So the state of good repair of this critical system pose many challenges, problems with most agencies that are grappling with. Next, please. Let me talk to you about the strategic plans. In my opinion, when I looked at this plan last year, actually, it was very refreshing. It talks about different strategic goals that covers all sorts of issues, from safety, from economic strength and global competitiveness, equity, climate and sustainability, and transformation. And I've been concentrating on the area of climate and sustainability, which focuses on development of tools and use of relevant data. Again, relevant data. Do we have the right data to do resiliency analysis? To improve our understanding of the environmental impacts of the transportation projects. And at the same time, deploying methods to mitigate the risk posed by climate stresses. There are a lot of unknowns here, but this is what the strategic plan is mentioning as far as the different type of research that we plan to initiate by different modes, and the modes of programs that Rebecca talked about earlier. Next, please. Now, next, please, again. I think I was ahead of you one. So what are our activities? We were doing, over the past year, we were doing a lot of coordination. We were making every effort to coordinate with other DOT modes within the agency, with our policy office and our external partners to gain a better understanding of current state of practice and research on the impacts of climate change on the transportation system, and to ensure that there would be no duplicated efforts when initiating any research studies from our part. At the same time, we want to learn about the gaps in knowledge and how we can support our stakeholders to implement resilience into their asset management plan. Again, it goes back to the question that was raised earlier. Okay, we have a policy issues, and we have all those sort of supports from federal government. How do you implement it in your asset management plan? That's $1 million question. Next, please. So the first thing that we did, we established a resilience coalition to focus on the knowledge gaps of climate resilience in transportation. So we partnered with AASHTO to assemble a coalition of surface transportation experts from different modes. And I believe there were about 15 individuals. And they found that there were a range of challenges to resilience planning and implementation. And to overcome some of those challenges, they came up with some guidelines. So this is a white paper that was just published last week, and I will provide the information, the link to that later on. So the challenges were like, for example, on capacity and understanding, that we need to have a common understanding across departments in the organization at various levels of leadership and management. Also, there is a need for investment in training and education for current and future transportation professionals to employ resilience-based methodology in the asset management planning and implementation. If you go to any state highway agency, there is not one dedicated person that is working on resilience. The topic of policy and funding, I think federal policy has to be tailored to account for resilience planning and implementation. Data and information, we need to really have a comprehensive data coverage and information that understands the data can give us information on the impact of climate change. Metrics and methods, we have to have metrics on how to measure resiliency. We need to have tools and technology that can provide us return on investment or other approaches that implement methodology, resilience methodology. But the most important thing, in my opinion, is a lack of a design guides. If you don't have a design guides, it's very challenging to ask your state highway agency to do what we are doing as far as under our guidelines for policy. It's very, very challenging. Next, please. Another program that we worked on, the research program, which a software called Resilience and Disaster Recovery Tool Suite, which was developed by Volpe Center, but was a collaboration with Federal Highway Administration and our office. This tool enables transportation agency to assess transportation resilience rate of return for specific transportation assets, mainly on flooding and on surface transportation, on pavement. I believe they were also looking at also transit modes to have some sort of a guidelines for that on this program. For a state highway agency, I believe they pilot tested RDR. Next, please. Another program that we have initiated last month, the NCHRP 2332, which is Transportation Asset Risk and Resilience. You could say that the outcome of this study is probably a generic guidelines on resilience, but we are looking to develop a science-based technical resource to assess risk and resilience in transportation planning, design, construction, and maintenance decisions. Next, please. Actually, this was very interesting. I want to talk about the 5th National Climate Assessment. It's an excellent report. If you haven't looked at it, please do so. It's a congressionally mandated interagency effort that provides a scientific foundation to support informed decision making across the United States. It has about, I believe, 13 chapters. Every chapter is talk about different mode of addressing different resiliency mode. For example, on water, energy, agriculture, ecosystem, ocean, and one on transportation. The transportation, it provides a good understanding of the climate risks and impacts and responses. For your information, this report to Congress was developed by the U.S. Global Change Research Program. Next, please. And in the same report, this is also very interesting. The transportation chapter for 5th National Climate Report covers the way people, goods, and services travel have changed since 1990, especially with dramatic rise of the internet traffic. These changes create new challenges, such as cybersecurity, as shown, infrastructure resilience, and our workforce, which are increasing the policy decision in transportation. Means we have to have a new policies. We have to have a new risk associated with these issues. And these decisions will shape the future of our climate outcomes. So you see the magnitude of challenges in employing the resilience program. Next, please. Again, the credit for this graph should go to Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. This graph talks about the new frameworks and competencies that has to be able to address the risk associated with the climate change. The proposed resilience planning cycle shown here is a great starting point to ensure the pursuit of resilience is ongoing, adaptable, and both immediately relevant and future focused. But the whole process is underpinned by strong climate resiliency policy. Definitely there is a need for that. Next, please. Now, after all the meetings we had with all the modes and talking to a lot of state highway agencies, expert group, and also attending a lot of conferences, this is something that we just listed for our office. And these are some things that we are trying to see if we can address at least some of these questions in short terms. We want to make sure that we have a proactive approach to resiliency rather than reactive. We want to break down the organizational silos by sharing information. You have to incorporate a multimodal transportation strategy when we design a bridge. We want to make sure that every mode, every system around it also is resilience. We want to consider multi-hazard risk-based approaches. We definitely have to incorporate cybersecurity risk. We definitely need for training and professional developments. And we really want to institute dedicated resilience staff. Those are just proposals to state highway agencies. Next, please. There are a lot of innovative solutions that I think we should take advantage of, tools and technologies. In my opinion, we are not doing that. And we want to take advantage of evidence-based decision-making support tools that we need the right data, we need the good data, and implementing resilience policy. Next, please. Next year, we were hoping to do this year, but we couldn't do it. But next year, we want to issue an RFI with sections focusing on resilience and decarbonization and novel materials. The expectation is for us to have a good understanding of the currently available and upcoming promising tools and technologies and novel materials. Next, please. And I'm going to end by saying that, as Charles Darwin said, it's not the strongest that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the ones most responsive to change. I'll stop there, and thank you so much for your attention.
All right, thank you, Hamid. So, Rebecca, my suggestion is we just start out with specific questions for Hamid, any clarification, and then we'll open up the broader discussion. Does that work for you?
That's just fine.
All right, so any specific questions for Hamid? This crowd's generally not very shy.
So Dan, I think I have a question, but didn't Ben want to ask a question before that he was going to wait? Should we ask him? I don't know.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'll ask the question.
Yes. As you know.
Yeah. My question is, there's a lot of uncertainties in the climate hazard projections. And I was wondering what DOT is doing to address those future uncertainties, and whether you're going to promote this concept of dynamic adaptation or dynamic adaptive pathway concepts.
I don't know much about this adaptation, but you're absolutely right. There's a lot of uncertainties. One thing that we don't have right now is the climate information on local jurisdiction. And those by itself is a huge challenge. Again, if you're looking at a system approach for entire country, we can't just rely on making our bread and butter structures or lifeline structure resilience. It has to work for all. But there are a lot of uncertainties. One uncertainty is the lack of enough data. We don't have information on our infrastructure. Most of them are subjective data. We are looking at quantitative information. We don't have a lot of post-hazard evaluation. We can learn from post-hazard evaluation and condition of your structure. It's like a laboratory, a real-life laboratory, but we don't have any data on those things. Unless we don't have those data, there is a challenge to implementing resiliency.
All right, thank you. Ben, I'm going to jump to you, and then I've got Joe and Norma Jean.
Thanks, Dan. I think my questions are for both Hamid and Rebecca, and related to the last question. One for your grant recipients, when we're asking them to account for climate change, build resiliency into their proposals, I was wondering if you all could say just a few words about what kind of guidance you provide in terms of what information and what tools your prospective grant recipients should be using to show that they are accounting for a changing climate over time. Do you refer them to the Fifth National Climate Assessment, other online tools? And then just the other really quick question is whether there are either on the books or if there are opportunities to point to future ASCE standards in all of this.
All
Let me
right,
talk.
Hamid. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll take one shot with the Protect program. How about that? And then you follow up. Does that sound good?
Yep.
All right, so having been on some of the review panels for the Protect program, there are some existing databases and tools that we can point grant recipients tool. The Department of Transportation maintains the CGES tool. It is similar to other work that we have that looks at both equity and climate change. And so how we are providing, downscale data at a community relevant location. I think we can all acknowledge this is one of the major challenges, is how to get the information at the scale relevant to a particular asset. If we're talking at a major interstate, yes, we've got to do one thing, which could be very different than this particular sidewalk location or a particular bend in a river that you're trying to mitigate impacts from flooding in a rural community in Virginia. So I think one of the biggest challenges is providing that information at the local scale. I will say, you're from NOAA, you're representing, we do have a very important collaboration with NOAA. And with that, we have the existing MOU to help with accessing some of that information. We're looking at going into providing more technical assistance. So that's the other element here, as we've recognized some communities, especially the larger metropolitan areas, have staff that are very well informed about climate relevant information for their general location. Where we're seeing the major challenges are on rural and tribal lands, where you have the one person that has 10 other collaborative duties, and they have a very true challenge if we aren't given, a particular database saying, go into this particular file and look at this location. Those are, your risk at that point. I think we would all like to be able to give people the information that they can work with in the design for their site. Where the contractors can provide some of that information, the A&E firms, et cetera, that is helpful, but we are seeing a range of the ability of the project proponents to work with that information. And I think that's why you're seeing that broad effort across the US government to recognize the need for technical assistance, to work directly with those particular locations on that relevant information. So that's a great way of saying it depends, but we're saying we have seen some come in with robust state level climate adaptation plans, incredible local relevant designs with multiple vulnerability assessments and, incredibly detailed data, to other locations saying, yes, this consistently floods and we have a hard time getting people through. We need to fix this. And that's literally what some of their statements come to say. So I do think we're definitely hitting on some of these critical points for project design and allocation of resources. And I think that's why you're seeing so many of these programs implement a planning and technical assistance element, so we can actually help these proponents develop the relevant projects.
Ben, as far as your second question, you talked about ASCE guidelines or specifications. Is that your question?
Yeah, I mean, first, if there are any references to ASCE standards in your current guidelines, or if not, do we see an opportunity for that in the future, especially as this whole effort is aiming to influence the next generation of ASCE standards to factor in a changing climate?
I mean, I totally agree with you. I talked about silos, and I really think we need to work together. There are a lot of information that we can use interchangeably. Some of the NCHRP project that probably is going to be resolved will be out probably in a year or 2 years. It's something that probably can benefit you and us at the same time. Yeah, but remember, the Protect program also is a very new program. So it takes a couple of years before we see any results on that too. But there are a lot of good programs and research programs, research study as part of the Protect program. And those are all could be some guided way for the ASCE specifications and so forth.
All right, excellent. All right, Joe, and then Norma, Jean, and then Mari, and then we might need to kind of think about wrapping up.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Really appreciate you highlighting our $1 billion disasters and the National Climate Assessment. For reference, we have downscaled some of the tools with the $1 billion disasters to the county and the census tract level. So you can look at that data in that reference. But my question is actually about, do you have some examples of metrics that you think you'll use with regard to resilience, going forward, that, hey, if you're able to do this, this is how you would quantify that resilience over the life cycle of some infrastructure. And then it perhaps goes towards Ben's question of what kind of information might help you better design that, whether it be through standard or environmental information.
Oh, you froze, Joe.
Or it's trying to think of.
I think we lost Joe. Oh, nope, he's still there.
Still there?
I'm still here. It just blinked. Sorry about that. It mainly is a question about example metrics and how that's useful. And what we're trying to think about is how we might tie some of our information or standards to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very, very good question. What are the metrics? As I mentioned earlier, these metrics could be different for every agency. I know some of the agencies, as far as the metrics is, for example, for bridges, what is their load carrying capacity right now? Does it carry, can it carry the load or not? Just to be too specific. But they're not all in the same category as loading. Some state I'm not going to mention to you, they think that wash the bridges with hoses, that's the type of a resiliency that they expect to have, longer life, less maintenance, and so forth. So it's all over the place. And the matrix that actually I'm talking to you about is actually as part of NCHRP 2332. We are hoping to come up with something meaningful at the end of the day that covers most of the modes. And it's very challenging. You brought it up.
Yeah,
Very
and
challenging.
I'll follow up on that one, Hamid. Also, I mentioned this MOU with NOAA. We actually added in an evaluation component of that, and it really is to work on developing the metrics and seeing if there is corresponding information available to, to supplement those metrics. I think the PROTECT program and what's coming through with that, I mean, the fact that they just had, the request for information and they're working through that, that is a requirement to have those metrics through the program. I don't have a timeline for the information coming out of that, but I do know that is a key place that we will have some definitive information to share more broadly on that particular component as well. And that is specific to resilience.
Excellent. All right, Norma Jean.
All right. Trying to see if, okay. Thank you, all three of you, for those presentations. This question is for Hamid, and it's really along the same lines as Ben's, and a little bit of Joe's question, but it's about one of your slides. So you showed a slide, and I think, but I don't remember specifically what the headline was. But the header was something like, I assume that it's building resilience into all transportation assets. And then you had a list. Data was one, metrics was another. And then the bottom was design guides. So it's a little bit more of a specific question. Is the design guides that you're referring to more along the lines of the ones typically put out by AASHTO as a design guide for specific transportation assets, or is it something that's more generic?
I'm thinking about generic than something coming out of the AASHTO. The Green Book of AASHTO, it takes probably a decade to have a design guide. So this is more generic, which can be tailored to all modes. And that's what we are thinking about.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks. Mari?
My question is very, very similar, actually. I think thank you all three of you for your presentations. They were excellent. I think the design guide question is a really, really critical piece in all of this. As you said, Hamid, that's where everything suddenly falls off the plate. We've got a great idea about what the resilience actions are we need to do, but then when it comes down to it, the municipalities or sort of just small consultancies or whatever, where they don't have the money and the training, what they lack is some form of guide or design standard. And that's what we've been working on within this group, is the standards, because that's what you can affect, but that's a 10-year process in and of itself. So really, I'm very interested in how we could forge that relationship to kind of build that gap, fill that gap between all of us quicker and easier without duplication. Yeah.
I mean, that's excellent. I mean, I really think we should take baby steps. I don't know how many of you have worked in the state highway agencies. I have. And you need a Bible for anything to be implemented. You don't have it, it's impossible to do that. And you have to have something very simple and easy. We need to have a new culture for implementation, from policy all the way to design and recommendations.